The city streets were quiet that evening, bathed in the soft glow of flickering streetlights. An old man walked alone, his steps steady but slow, the weight of his years visible in the way he carried himself. James Carter had lived in this neighborhood for decades, watching it change, watching the faces come and go. He wasn't a rich man, nor was he one for trouble. Just an honest, hard-working soul who had seen enough in life to know that kindness could be rare, but that didn't mean it wasn't worth giving. As he turned the corner, heading toward his small apartment, the air felt different. He could sense it. A chilling silence replaced the usual distant hum of traffic. That was when he heard it. Laughter. Not the warm kind, but cruel, mocking. It came from a group of young men standing near a convenience store, their eyes locking onto him the moment he came into view. James knew the look in their eyes. He'd seen it before, years ago, in a different time, a different place. Contempt. Hatred. The kind of look that didn't need words to make its meaning clear. He sighed, heaping his head down, hoping to just walk past without incident. But hope, as he had learned many times before, wasn't always enough. "Hey, old man," one of them called out, stepping forward. The others snickered, watching like a pack of wolves circling their prey. James didn't respond. He wasn't looking for trouble. But trouble, it seemed, had already found him. "What? Too good to talk to us?" Another voice, sharper this time. Closer. James took a breath, steadying himself. "I'm just trying to get home, son," he said, his voice calm but firm. The leader of the group, a tall, lean young man with a cruel smirk, stepped directly into James's path. "Home, huh? What makes you think you belong here?" James clenched his jaw. He had seen this kind of attitude before, the same ignorance, the same cruelty that had plagued him in his younger years. He had fought too hard, lived too long, to let it shake him now. "I was here long before you were born," he said, meeting the young man's gaze without fear. "And I'll be here long after you've grown tired of this nonsense." The leader's smirk faded for a second, replaced by something colder. "You got a mouth on you, old man." James sighed again, shaking his head. "And you've got nothing better to do than pick on an old man. That's a shame." The words, meant to diffuse the situation, only seemed to fuel the anger in their eyes. The group tightened their circle, their voices turning from mocking to threatening. "Maybe you need to learn some respect," one of them sneered. Before James could react, the first shove came, knocking him slightly off balance. His hands went up, not in aggression, but in a silent plea for peace. But peace was not what they were looking for. Another shove, then another. His back hit the wall, and suddenly, the world felt smaller, darker. The streetlights above flickered, casting long shadows over the group as they closed in. James had been through worse. He had survived wars, heartbreak, and decades of struggle. But at this moment, he wasn't thinking about himself. He was thinking about his son. Miles away, in a high-security military base, General Marcus Carter sat in his office, his sharp eyes scanning a report in front of him. A man of discipline, honor, and unshakable resolve, Marcus had dedicated his life to protecting his country. But there was one man he had always sought to protect above all else, his father. And in just a few moments, he was about to get a call that would change everything. James Carter braced himself against the cold brick wall, feeling the weight of the years in his bones, but not in his spirit. He had lived through too much, seen too many hard days, to let fear take over now. Still, he wasn't foolish. He knew these young men weren't just looking for words. They wanted something else. Power, control, a sense of dominance over someone they saw as weak. One of them stepped forward, cracking his knuckles. The leader, the tall one with the cruel smirk, just stood back and watched, like he was enjoying the show before it even started. James lifted his hands slightly, not in defense, but as a sign of reason. "You boys have nothing to prove to me," he said calmly. "Go home. Forget about this." But reason wasn't what they wanted. "Not so fast, old man." The leader's voice was smooth, calculated. "You walk through here like you belong. Like you don't see who really runs these streets. James looked him straight in the eyes. And who is that? A murmur of amusement rippled through the group. The leader stepped closer, the smell of cheap cologne and cigarette smoke lingering in the air. Us, he said. People like us. Not people like you. James had heard that kind of talk before. It wasn't new. Just an old song played by a new band. But it didn't make it any easier to hear. He knew what came next. He could feel it in the way they moved, in the way their energy shifted from talk to something more dangerous. Then the first fist came. It wasn't a hard punch, more of a test, like they were waiting to see if he would fight back. But James had nothing to prove. He staggered slightly but didn't fall. He wouldn't give them that. The leader grinned. Still standing, he tilted his head. You're tougher than you look. James wiped the corner of his mouth, feeling the faint sting where the punch had landed. His heart was steady, but his mind was racing. He wasn't afraid, but he was outnumbered. And he knew, deep down, that this wouldn't stop here. Miles away in his office, General Marcus Cato was reviewing classified reports when his personal phone buzzed. He almost ignored it. Only a few people had this number, and most knew better than to call during work hours. But something made him glance at the screen. Unknown number. That was strange. He frowned but answered, General Carter. There was a hesitation on the other end. Then a voice, shaky, uncertain. Sir, I don't know if this is the right number, but I think something's happening to your dad. Marcus's entire body tensed. Who is this? I work at the store down the street from his place. I saw him walk past a little while ago, and there's a group of guys following him. They didn't look friendly. Marcus felt the air leave his lungs for a brief moment. His father was strong, proud, but he was also old. He wasn't invincible. Where? Marcus asked, already standing, already grabbing his coat. The man on the phone gave him the location, an address Marcus knew all too well. His childhood neighborhood, the streets where he had grown up, where his father had raised him with discipline and love. He had left that place behind when he joined the military, believing his father would always be safe there. But now, a cold realization gripped him. He had been wrong. As Marcus rushed out of his office, his mind was sharp, his emotions controlled. Years of training had prepared him for crisis situations. But this wasn't just any mission. This was personal. Meanwhile, back in the alleyway, James was struggling to stay on his feet. Another shove, another punch. He still hadn't fought back. He wouldn't, not because he couldn't, but because he knew the moment he did, things would escalate beyond control. The leader of the group stepped closer, staring at James like he was studying him. You're not scared, he muttered, almost like he didn't understand. Why aren't you scared? James exhaled, shaking his head. Because I've seen worse men than you, he said quietly, and I've survived all of them. The leader frowned, as if those words hit something inside him he didn't expect. But before he could respond, something changed. The sound of tires screeching, a car pulling up fast, doors slamming. The gang turned just in time to see a tall, broad-shouldered man stepping out of a black SUV. His movements were precise, controlled, his eyes scanning the situation like he had already analyzed 100 possible outcomes. Marcus Carter didn't speak right away. He didn't need to. His presence alone shifted the energy in the alleyway. The men who had been circling James a moment ago were suddenly uncertain, their confidence cracking. James, still breathing heavily, looked up at his son. For the first time that night, relief flickered across his face. The leader of the group stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. Who the hell are you? He asked, though his voice lacked the same arrogance it had before. Marcus's gaze locked onto him, steady, unshaken. You don't want to find out, he said. The street lights buzzed overhead, casting long shadows. The air was thick with tension, the kind that only existed before something inevitable happened. The gang exchanged glances. Some looked ready to stand their ground. Others were already taking a step back. Marcus took a slow step forward. His posture wasn't aggressive, but it was powerful, controlled. "Walk away," he said simply. For the first time that night, the leader hesitated. He looked at James, then back at Marcus. Something in the way Marcus carried himself, something in his voice, in his eyes, made it clear. This was a fight they wouldn't win. But pride was a dangerous thing, and for some, it was worth more than common sense. The leader clenched his jaw. "Or what?" Marcus didn't blink. "You really want to find out?" Silence. One of the younger guys in the group shifted uncomfortably. "Come on, man," he muttered. "Let's go." But the leader wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. He stared at Marcus, trying to measure him, trying to decide if whatever fight he was thinking about starting was worth it. Marcus didn't move. He just waited. James, still leaning against the wall, exhaled slowly. He knew his son. He knew what he was capable of. And he also knew that, in this moment, Marcus wasn't just standing there as a soldier or a general. He was standing there as a son, protecting his father. The question was, would the gang see the warning for what it was? Or were they about to make the worst mistake of their lives? The air was thick with tension. The leader of the group stared at Marcus, his jaw tight, his fists clenched. His pride was at stake now, and Marcus could see it in his eyes. He wasn't ready to just walk away. But the young man also wasn't a fool. He could tell that Marcus was different. This wasn't some random guy stepping in. There was something about him, his stance, his controlled breathing, the way he didn't flinch under pressure. He carried himself like a man who had seen real danger, real battles, and that made him unpredictable. The rest of the group had already started to shift uncomfortably. They weren't so sure anymore. One of them, a shorter guy with a nervous expression, whispered, "Man, I don't like this. Let's go." The leader didn't even look at him. His eyes stayed locked on Marcus. "You think you can just walk in here and tell us what to do?" he asked, his voice sharp, but there was a slight crack in his confidence now. Marcus didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, knowing that sometimes silence was more powerful than words. Then finally he spoke, low, steady. "I don't need to tell you anything. I'm giving you a choice." The leader scoffed, trying to regain some ground. "And what if I don't take it?" Marcus took another step forward, his eyes like steel. "Then you deal with me." His voice wasn't raised. It wasn't a threat. It was a fact. The leader's fingers twitched at his side. He was trying to decide, trying to weigh his options. He had been in fights before. He had won most of them. But this wasn't a street fight. This was different. And then there was James. The old man was still standing, leaning against the wall, but not broken. His eyes were steady, watching, waiting. The young man didn't like that. He didn't like that James had never shown fear, not even when they pushed him around. And now, standing next to this man, this stranger who had walked in like he owned the whole block, it made him feel small. His pride burned, his blood boiled. He wasn't the kind of guy who just backed down. But something deep inside told him that if he made the wrong move tonight, things wouldn't end well for him. Finally, he exhaled sharply and stepped back. He didn't look at James. He didn't look at Marcus. He just turned to his crew. "Let's go." One by one, the others followed, some hesitant, some relieved. The nervous one was the first to hurry off. The last one to leave shot Marcus a long look, as if trying to understand who he really was. Then, just like that, they were gone. But Marcus didn't relax. Not yet. His eyes stayed on them until they disappeared around the corner. Only then did he turn to his father. James gave a tired but knowing smile. "Took you long enough." Marcus let out a breath, shaking his head. "You okay?" James nodded, brushing the dust off his jacket. "I've been through worse." Marcus frowned, scanning him for any real injuries. He had been shoved around, maybe hit once, but nothing serious. Still, the sight of his father in this situation made his stomach tighten. "You should have called me." James gave him a look. "And say what?" Hey, son, I think some punks are about to hassle me. Come on now. Marcus wasn't amused. This isn't a joke, Dad. James sighed, his expression softening. I know, but I also knew you'd come. Marcus shook his head, frustrated but relieved. His father had always been like this, tough, independent, refusing to show weakness. It was one of the reasons Marcus had become the man he was today. But tonight proved something. His father wasn't untouchable. And that realization didn't sit well with him. As they walked toward James' apartment, Marcus's mind was racing. This wasn't just a random act of violence. These guys weren't just looking for trouble, they had been targeting James. And for what? Because of the color of his skin, because they thought they could get away with it. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Marcus wasn't going to let it happen again. James could sense the thoughts running through his son's head. As they reached his front door, he turned to Marcus and said, "Don't go looking for trouble, son. You don't have to fix everything." Marcus met his father's gaze, his expression unreadable. "I don't go looking for trouble," he said simply, "but I don't ignore it either." James sighed but didn't argue. He knew his son too well. That night, after making sure his father was safe inside, Marcus sat in his car, staring out at the quiet street. But his mind wasn't quiet. Something about this didn't feel over. And he was right. Across town, in a dimly lit apartment, the leader of the gang sat on a torn couch, his jaw clenched. His friends had all left, but he was still stewing in anger. He hated the way that night had ended. He hated that man, whoever he was, for walking in and making him feel powerless. His phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. A name flashed across it, someone he hadn't expected to hear from. He hesitated, then answered, "Yeah." The voice on the other end was low, calm, but with an edge of authority. "I heard you ran into someone interesting tonight." The leader frowned. "What's it to you?" There was a pause. Then the voice said, "Do you have any idea who that man was?" The leader's fingers tightened around the phone, just some guy trying to act tough. Another pause, then a quiet chuckle. "You really don't know, do you?" The leader didn't like where this was going. "Know what?" The voice on the phone sighed. "You just picked a fight with General Marcus Carter." The leader sat up straighter. The name meant nothing to him. "So?" The voice on the other end of the line gave a dry laugh. "So, you just made an enemy out of one of the most dangerous men in the country." A heavy silence filled the air. And for the first time that night, the young gang leader felt something he hadn't before. Regret. Marcus sat in his car for a long time, staring at the darkened street outside his father's apartment. His hands rested on the steering wheel, but his mind was far from still. Something about tonight felt unfinished. The way that gang had backed off, it wasn't because they had a sudden change of heart. It was because they had sensed something about him, something they couldn't quite place, and it made them hesitate. But hesitation didn't mean surrender. His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. He glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. A gut feeling told him to answer. "General Carter," he said, his voice firm. There was a pause on the other end. Then a voice, rough but controlled. "Looks like you made an impression tonight." Marcus frowned, his grip on the phone tightening. "Who is this?" The caller let out a small chuckle. "Someone who knows those boys you ran into." Marcus felt his pulse slow, not in fear, but in that calculated way his mind worked when something serious was unfolding. His training kicked in, scanning for details in the man's voice. Older, experienced, not some street thug. "I don't have time for games," Marcus said evenly. "This ain't a game, General." The voice was quieter now, but it carried weight. "You stepped into something tonight. Those kids, they weren't acting alone. There's more to this than what you saw." Marcus leaned forward, resting his elbow on the steering wheel. His voice stayed steady, but now there was an edge to it. "Then tell me what I don't know." There was another pause, as if the man was deciding how much to say. Then finally, "You need to keep an eye on your old man." Marcus's jaw clenched. Is that a threat? It's a warning, the man corrected. Those boys, especially their leader, he won't let this go. And he's got people behind him who won't like what happened tonight. Marcus exhaled slowly, controlling the slow burn rising in his chest. If they come near my father again, they're going to regret it. A brief silence followed. Then the voice replied, almost amused, "Yeah, I figured you'd say something like that." The call ended. Marcus stared at the phone for a moment before tossing it onto the passenger seat. His gut was right. This wasn't over. Meanwhile, across town, the gang leader sat in the dimly lit room, his knee bouncing with frustration. He had been restless ever since the call. The name Marcus Carter still didn't mean much to him, but the reaction it got from certain people did. One of his older connections, someone he had worked for in the past, had laughed when he heard the story. "You really don't know who you messed with, do you?" the man had said. Now, the young leader was beginning to understand. Marcus Carter wasn't just some tough guy who happened to show up. He was trained, experienced, and worst of all, he wasn't afraid. That meant one thing. If they wanted to prove they ran these streets, they couldn't just let this go. His pride was already bruised from how things ended. If he walked away now, his reputation would crumble. And in his world, that wasn't an option. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. One of his crew, a lanky kid with nervous energy, stepped inside. "They're ready," he muttered. The leader stood up, cracking his knuckles. "Good. Let's remind that old man who really owns this city." Back at James' apartment, the old man sat by his small kitchen table, sipping tea. He wasn't rattled. He had lived through worse. But he wasn't careless, either. He knew trouble when he saw it. A soft knock at the door made him glance up. He didn't expect visitors this late. Slowly, he stood and moved to the peephole. A woman, mid-30s, worn face, tired eyes. Someone he had seen around the neighborhood before, though he didn't know her name. James opened the door slightly, his hand still gripping the knob. "Can I help you?" She shifted on her feet, looking over her shoulder before speaking in a hushed tone. "They're coming back." James' expression didn't change, but his stomach tightened. "Who?" "You know who," she said. "They think you made them look weak, and they can't let that go." James sighed, rubbing his temple. "Why are you telling me this?" Her gaze flickered with something, guilt, maybe. "Because I got a little brother running with them. He's too young to get caught up in this mess." James nodded slowly. "I appreciate the warning." She hesitated before adding, "Be careful." Then she turned and hurried down the hall, disappearing into the night. James closed the door and exhaled. He didn't doubt her. He had seen the look in those boys' eyes earlier. They weren't done. And he also knew his son wouldn't just sit back and let this happen. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. He answered without looking. "Yeah." Marcus's voice was sharp. "They're coming back, Dad." James smirked slightly. "I just got the same news." There was a pause. Then Marcus said, "I'm on my way." James shook his head. "Don't start a war, son." "I'm not," Marcus said, "but I'm gonna end one." James sighed but didn't argue. He knew his son too well. Outside, the night stretched on, silent but heavy, like the city itself was holding its breath. The storm hadn't arrived yet, but it was coming. Marcus drove through the quiet streets, his grip firm on the steering wheel. His mind was racing, calculating every possible scenario. He knew these kinds of people. Their pride wouldn't let them walk away. They'd come back, not just to prove a point, but to send a message, and that meant his father was in danger. He pulled up outside James' apartment, scanning the area. Everything looked normal, too normal. He stepped out, his instincts sharp, his movements precise. As he approached the entrance, the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. Something wasn't right. Inside, James sat in his chair, his gaze steady on the door. He wasn't afraid, but he wasn't reckless either. He had been in enough situations to know when the air felt wrong. He glanced at the clock. Late, even for troublemakers. But trouble didn't follow a schedule. Then, a knock. Not loud, not hurried, but deliberate. James stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing. He moved to the door, pressing his ear against it. Silence. Then, "It's me." Marcus's voice. James unlocked the door, pulling it open. Marcus stepped in, his expression tight. "They're coming," he said immediately. James nodded. "I know." Marcus scanned the small apartment. "You go a back way out." James exhaled. "I'm not running, son." Marcus clenched his jaw. "It's not about running, it's about strategy." Before James could respond, something outside caught Marcus' attention. A car, creeping slowly down the street. Lights off. Moving too carefully, Marcus stepped to the window, his body tense. "Then I hear," he muttered. James joined him, peering through the curtains. The car came to a stop, and 3 figures stepped out. But something was different. These weren't the same kids from earlier. The leader was there, sure, but the men flanking him were older, meaner. The kind of men who didn't just pick fights. They ended them. Marcus's stomach tightened. This wasn't just some gang trying to save face anymore. Someone else was involved now. James saw it too. He let out a slow breath. This just got complicated. Marcus turned to him. "Stay here." James' eyebrows lifted. "Oh, now you're giving orders?" Marcus sighed. "Dad." James raised a hand. "Relax. I'm not stupid." Marcus moved toward the door, every movement calculated. He wasn't here to start a fight, but if one came to him, he wouldn't hesitate. He stepped outside, letting the door click shut behind him. The night air was thick, humming with tension. The leader of the gang stepped forward, a smirk playing at his lips. But it wasn't the same arrogant smirk from earlier. This one was different, controlled, calculated, like he knew something Marcus didn't. "You made quite the impression, General," he said, his voice dripping with mock respect. Marcus didn't react. He simply tilted his head. "You bringing backup now?" His eyes flicked to the 2 men beside him. "Didn't think you could handle this on your own." The leader chuckled. "I could. But see, this isn't just about me anymore." He gestured to the men. "These guys, they don't like what you did. You embarrassed us. Made us look weak." His smile faded. "And that's bad for business." Marcus's jaw tightened. "What business?" The leader's smirk widened. "See, that's the thing. You stepped into something bigger than you realized." He motioned to one of the older men. "This here is Raymond. He's not just some guy off the street. He's been running things around here for years. And you? You disrespected his people." Marcus finally looked at the man on the left. Raymond, mid-40s, scar along his jaw, cold eyes. The kind of man who didn't waste time with empty threats. Raymond studied Marcus for a long moment. Then finally he spoke. "You should have walked away when you had the chance." Marcus felt his heartbeat slow, the calm before a storm. "I don't walk away when my family's involved." Raymond's expression didn't change. "Then you just made this personal." A low hum of tension passed between them. The leader of the gang took a step back, letting Raymond take control. Marcus could feel it now. This wasn't just about his father. This was bigger. The gang had been working under someone else, someone with real power. And by stepping in, Marcus had just put himself in their sights. From inside, James was watching, his gut twisting. He had seen men like Raymond before, and he knew exactly what kind of trouble was coming. The silence stretched, heavy and dangerous. Then Raymond spoke again, his voice calm but sharp as a knife. "I'll give you one chance, General. Take your father, get in your car, and drive away. Don't come back." Marcus didn't move. His eyes stayed locked on Raymond's. "And if I don't?" Raymond smiled, but it wasn't friendly. "Then things get messy." Marcus inhaled slowly. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down. One wrong move, and this would turn into something neither side could walk away from. And then, a sudden noise. Tires screeching down the street, headlights cutting through the darkness. Everyone turned. Another car, fast, headed straight for them. Marcus's instincts flared. This wasn't part of the plan. And then, gunfire. A single shot rang out, shattering the night. And everything exploded into chaos. The gunshot shattered the night, and in an instant, everything moved at once. Marcus dropped low, instincts kicking in as he scanned for the source of the shot. Raymond and his men scrambled, diving for cover as the incoming car skidded to a stop. Doors flew open, and more figures emerged from the darkness. For a brief moment, no one knew who had fired. The gang leader had ducked behind a car, his usual cocky expression now wiped clean. Raymond, still crouched, was barking orders to his men, his face tight with frustration. This wasn't part of their plan either. Marcus, keeping his head low, turned his focus to the new arrivals. He didn't recognize them at first, but then his eyes landed on the man stepping forward, tall, bold, wearing a long coat that billowed slightly in the night air. And then it clicked. Agent Collins. Marcus exhaled sharply. The FBI. Collins strode forward, his men spreading out with quiet precision. He didn't raise his weapon, but the tension in his stance made it clear he was in control. His gaze swept across the street, taking in the chaos. "Looks like I showed up just in time," he said, his voice calm but edged with authority. Raymond stood slowly, eyeing Collins with thinly veiled irritation. "What the hell is this?" Collins smirked slightly. This is a federal investigation, and you, Raymond, just walked straight into it." Marcus's mind was racing. The FBI wasn't here for him or his father. They were here for Raymond. Raymond's expression darkened. "You got nothing on me." Collins raised an eyebrow. "Don't I?" He pulled a small device from his pocket and pressed a button. A crackling sound filled the air, and then voices. Marcus listened closely. It was a recording. He recognized Raymond's voice, low and sharp, talking about shipments, territories, payoffs. Evidence, solid evidence. Raymond's jaw tightened. The gang leader, still crouched behind cover, looked between Raymond and the agents, his eyes darting with sudden understanding. He had no idea what he had been caught up in. Collins took another step forward. "We've been building a case for months, and tonight, you just gave us everything we needed." Marcus finally stood, watching as the situation shifted. The power that Raymond had held moments ago was slipping away, unraveling right in front of him. Raymond turned his glare toward Marcus. "You knew about this." Marcus shook his head. "I didn't, but I knew there was more to you than just some street muscle." Raymond clenched his fists, but before he could say anything else, Collins lifted his chin toward his agents. "Take him." The FBI moved in swiftly, handcuffing Raymond and his men before they could react. The gang leader, still stunned, started to back away, but an agent grabbed his arm. "Wait," he stammered. "I didn't." Collins gave him a cool look. "You picked the wrong people to work for, kid." Marcus watched as they were loaded into unmarked cars, the tension finally starting to drain from the air. His muscles, still coiled from the fight-or-flight response, slowly began to ease. James stepped onto the porch, his hands in his pockets. He met Marcus's eyes, a small knowing smile tugging at his lips. "Well," he said dryly, "that was something." Marcus let out a breath. "Yeah, it was." Collins approached them, his expression shifting from authority to something closer to respect. "You handled yourself well, General." Marcus gave a small nod. "You knew this was going down tonight?" Collins shrugged. "We had a hunch something was happening, but you being here, that was unexpected." He paused. "And helpful." James chuckled. "That's my boy." Collins smirked. "I guess it runs in the family." He glanced at Marcus. "You ever think about working with us?" Marcus smirked back. "I just retired." Collins shrugged. "Offers open." Marcus simply nodded, watching as the agents finished loading the last of the criminals into their cars. Sirens filled the air, but for the first time that night, they weren't a warning. They were the sound of something ending. As the FBI convoy pulled away, Marcus turned to his father. "You okay?" James sighed but nodded. "I'm too old for this, son." Marcus smiled. "Yeah, let's get you inside." But just as they turned, a voice called out, "Wait." Marcus pivoted sharply, his hand instinctively moving toward his belt, but it wasn't a threat. It was the woman from earlier, the one who had warned James. She stepped forward hesitantly, glancing at the now empty street. "It's over." Marcus studied her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Yeah, it's over." She let out a long breath, relief washing over her. "Thank you." James gave her a kind smile. "You did the right thing." She hesitated before nodding. "I hope so." Then, with one last glance at the street, she turned and disappeared into the night. Marcus exhaled, looking up at the sky. The storm had passed. But deep down he knew one thing. In a city like this, trouble was never really gone. It just waited for the right moment to rise again. Marcus and James stood on the porch for a moment, watching as the last of the FBI vehicles disappeared down the street. The tension that had filled the night was finally fading, replaced by a strange kind of quiet. It was over, or at least this part of it was. James sighed and shook his head. "You know, when I woke up this morning, I thought the biggest thing I'd have to deal with was a leaky faucet." Marcus let out a small chuckle, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, life has a way of surprising you." James gave him a sideways look. "I think I've had enough surprises for a while." Marcus nodded, his expression softening as he looked at his father. James had been through enough tonight. He didn't say it out loud, but Marcus knew. If he hadn't shown up when he did, things could have gone a lot worse. They stepped inside, locking the door behind them. The apartment felt different now, as if the weight of the night had settled into the walls. James walked over to his chair and sat down with a deep sigh. Marcus sat across from him, studying him for a moment. "You okay?" James waved a hand. "I'm fine, just tired." He paused, then gave his son a knowing look. "And don't start with the whole 'you should move somewhere safer' speech." Marcus smirked. "I wasn't gonna say that." James raised an eyebrow. Marcus sighed. "Okay, maybe I was, but can you blame me? This kind of thing doesn't happen in normal neighborhoods." James leaned back. "Son, I've lived in this city longer than you've been alive. I know what it is, and I know what isn't, and no matter where you go, trouble can always find you." Marcus didn't argue. His father was stubborn, but he wasn't wrong. Trouble had a way of showing up when you least expected it. Tonight was proof of that. A moment of silence passed between them before James spoke again. "So what now?" Marcus exhaled, thinking, "I don't know, but I do know you should probably lay low for a while, just in case." James nodded. "And you?" Marcus hesitated, then leaned forward. "I think I'm gonna stick around a little longer." James looked at him, surprised. "You're staying?" Marcus shrugged. "Yeah, for now. I mean, someone's got to keep an eye on you." James scoffed. "I don't need a babysitter." Marcus smirked. "Never said you did." James shook his head but didn't argue. Deep down, he was relieved. He wouldn't admit it, but having Marcus here, even for a little while, made him feel just a little bit safer. Outside, the city was returning to normal. Street lights flickered, cars passed by, and life continued as if nothing had happened. But Marcus knew better. Raymond and his crew were out of the picture, but that didn't mean the streets were clean. There would always be another threat, another gang, another person looking to take power. That's just how the world worked. Still, tonight was a victory. And for now, that was enough. As the hours passed, the adrenaline wore off, replaced by exhaustion. Marcus eventually made his way to the small couch in the living room, stretching out with a tired groan. It wasn't comfortable, but it would do. James turned off the lights, leaving only the soft glow from the street outside. Before heading to bed, he looked at Marcus one last time. "Good night, son." Marcus, half asleep, mumbled, "Good night, Dad." And for the first time in a long time, there was peace. But just outside the window, in the shadows of the city, trouble was always watching, always waiting. And Marcus knew, when the time came, he'd be ready.